This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. And I take most of my stories about women today and yesterday from this book. Remember the Ladies. Remember the Ladies was Mrs. John Adams's advice to her husband about remembering the ladies when he was very busy working on what became the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Although it's primarily, of course, ascribed to Thomas Jefferson, who did the actual final writing. But John Adams was on the committee that was working on that in 1776. And so his wife gave him some advice to remember the ladies. And that's what we want to do on our program. These are May birth and death dates for famous women, this particular program. And since we had the first half of May essentially playing actually from what was done last year on May birthdays for the first half of the month of May, I'm going to concentrate now basically on the second half of May. And we begin with a well-known actress of the 20th century, namely Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth, who had beautiful red dyed hair. In fact, she appeared sometimes as with her hair dyed black and sometimes even blonde, but I think she's best remembered for wearing her hair red. And she was of Spanish descent background. Her birth name was Cancino when she was born in 1918 on the 14th of May. No, sorry, take that back. This is actually much more recent because this is a death date. Her death date at age 68 in 1987. So she was certainly a popular actress when I was a young person and a very memorable woman. She had 5 husbands, all of whom she eventually, one at a time of course, divorced. Probably the best known one was Orson Welles, who was, in fact, people occasionally spoke of them as the beauty in the brain, Welles being also an actor, but noted for his intellectual powers. He was sort of in the middle of her 5 husbands. But Remember the Ladies author stresses that she was a woman whose life was very much controlled by whoever was able to do it, namely, beginning with her father, her parents, especially her father, and then continuing on with at least 5 husbands, and all the men that she entranced, but did not wind up marrying. So she was definitely around for much of the 20th century, since this death date of May 14th occurred in 1987. For the 15th of May, we have Dorothy Hansine Anderson, who was a native of North Carolina and born in 1901 on May 15th. She was a medical doctor. In fact, she was a pioneering medical doctor at a time when very few women became MDs. And it was difficult for her to get a job, even once she had the MD, you know, since she was about the only woman doctor around. People just weren't used to having women as doctors, and it was difficult for her to find a job. But she went into sort of more into research rather than doing regular medical practice. And in fact, she is associated closely with the illness known as cystic fibrosis. In fact, she became the first person to really work on it. It was a disease that wasn't even had a name. Most of the babies who were born with cystic fibrosis in the time before Dorothy Anderson just died as babies, didn't even live to grow up to be studied, you know, their lives studied and so on. But Dr. Anderson became the person who really identified cystic fibrosis, and because of her work, eventually there were children who survived infancy despite their cystic fibrosis and were able to live to grow up. She was active through about into the 1960s, when she finally passed away, since she was born in 1901. For May 16th, we have a modern American poet, Adrienne Rich. And here's a nice picture, shows her face and her name, Adrienne, which must be French. It certainly looks like it came from the French. But she is an American woman, born in Baltimore on May 16th, 1929. It says that she came from quite a traditional family, pretty conservative, and she moved politically to the left. She published a number of works of poetry, and in fact, the first collection was called A Change of World, which certainly reflects what happened in her own lifetime, from coming from this quite conservative family to becoming a political woman. Now, she went to the women's college, Radcliffe University, a subsidy of, well, I should say a kind of a subsidiary of Harvard, was considered one of the 7 women's colleges, famous women's colleges, is Radcliffe. But interestingly enough, she never met a woman teacher during her years at Radcliffe. And she was born in 1929, which makes her, in terms of lifetime, almost a contemporary of me, since I was born in 1932. And so it was a surprise to me to learn that when Adrienne Rich went to Radcliffe, a women's college, she never met any women teachers at Radcliffe, because every single teacher that she had, and that would have been, like in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 50s. Every single teacher at Radcliffe that she had was a male teacher. Luckily, things have changed nowadays, and we find quite a few women faculty on college campuses in this time. But as I say, she was a very well-known poet, and she received a National Book Award in behalf of all women, she said. She was one of the few women who received that outstanding award, and that was in 1974, when she would have been a woman in her 60s. Now, one of the things that she was quite outspoken about, apparently, was pornography. She thought that pornography was really bad news, and of course, pornography usually shows sexual liaisons, various sexual liaisons, and it's not anything you want to have your children see, for sure. She commented on pornography that it was relentless in its message. The message is the message of the master to the slave. This is what you are, and this is what I can do to you. Because pornography, for the most part, shows women in sexual bondage of one kind or another to men. For the 17th of May, we have an American who is better known as a Brit. Her name is Lady Nancy Astor. Now, Lady Astor was an American, born and raised in Virginia, and in 1879 was her birth date. And about the year 1900, she moved to England, and there she met and married a famous rich man, John Jacob Astor. So she became Lady Nancy Astor. Now, John Jacob Astor was interested in politics, and so was his wife. In fact, in the year that they were married, in 1906, John Jacob Astor was elected to the British House of Commons. And finally, in 1919, he was elevated to the House of Lords. He became a peer of England, a member of the House of Lords. And his wife, Nancy Astor, ran for his seat in the House of Commons, the one that he had held for about a dozen years, and she was elected. And as a matter of fact, she was elected and re-elected and became a famous British stateswoman as a conservative, member of the Conservative Party, like her husband, in Great Britain. And she was a member of the House of Commons from 1919 till 1945. And what happened in 45 was that at the end, that, of course, you know, that was the last year of the Second World War. 1945 ended in May, just about this time of year, in the year 1945. And it was about that time that they were having an election in Britain. The elections in Britain are different from the ones here. They are called when the House of Parliament leaders decide that they need a new election. they aren't held on a regular basis the way ours are here, where nearly everyone is elected for a set term, such as 2 years for being a member of the House of Representatives, or 6 years for being a senator in the U.S. Senate. In Britain, they have this kind of floating way of having their elections. So in 1945, right at the end of the Second World War, people were, you would think, at least it was a surprise, I think, to many people in America, and even me. I was a youngster of 13 or so in 1945, but I was quite interested in current events and elections and what all, and so I remember being quite surprised when the British Parliament went for the Labour Party and turned out the Conservatives. So that's what happened to Lady Astor, Lady Nancy Astor, was she was among the many Conservative candidates for election in 1945 in England, who lost her seat after being there for a long, long time, more than 20 years. But she was an American who made good in British politics, for sure, Lady Nancy Astor. For the 18th of May, we have an American politician, her name, Jeannette Rankin. Jeannette Rankin is someone she really made American history because she was elected to Congress, and this date of May 18th is actually her death date, and she didn't die until 1973. I mean, I can remember when she was a well-known American politician, Jeannette Rankin. She died at 92, like I say, and it was as late as 1973. But she was the first woman elected to Congress, the Congress of the United States, and she was elected before women could vote. She was first elected in 1916, which was several years before women got the right to vote nationwide. Now, they could vote in California, where she was living, because the states had that right if they wanted to, if their legislature voted for women's suffrage, for women to vote, they could vote in some of the states, and California was one of those states, and Jeannette Rankin was the first woman elected to Congress, as I say, in 1916. Now, Jeannette Rankin was a famous pacifist. She believed in peace very, very thoroughly. She believed in peace. And her views were well known, that she was an outstanding pacifist person. So in 1916, of course, that was during the First World War, but it was before America, before the United States entered the war. We did not enter the war until April of 1917. And so Jeannette Rankin was actually a member of Congress before the United States entered the war, and she voted against war. She was, as I say, she didn't think the war would solve anything, and she was well-known pacifist. And she was the only person, I guess, maybe there were one or two others who voted against entry into World War I. She definitely was. Well, her constituents weren't too happy with that, and so when she ran again in 1918, she was defeated. So she, of course, continued active politically and was well known as being a pacifist. And she was elected again to Congress in 1939, and was at that time. So she became a congresswoman in 1940 when the new Congress set up. So she was a congresswoman in December of 1941 when there was a vote on the war, entering the war against Japan and Germany and Italy, who were the Axis powers. And of course, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into war. Well, she was the only person in the U.S. Congress who voted against war, even against war after the Japanese bombardment of Hawaii. And so, guess what? She ran, when she ran again to continue in Congress, she was not elected because most of her constituents were angry that she had voted against war for the second time. She voted, as I said, against the First World War, entering the First World War, and she followed up by voting against the Second World War because, as it happened, she was a congresswoman during the time when that question came before the U.S. Congress, whether to go to war. Anyway, she was very active in politics, even when she was not in Congress, and she lived until 1973, because May 18th, 1973 was her death date, and she was a woman over 90 years old when she died in California in 1973. So I remember her, I can remember reading about her life and her work in politics long ago when she was active in politics, even though she was not in Congress. For the 19th of May, we have a poet and a playwright, especially known as a playwright. Her name, Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry was born in 1930, and she wrote several plays, but the first play that she wrote was the most famous one, and she died all too young of cancer. But she wrote a play about the life of a black family who moved into a white neighborhood and the problems that they had with that. And of course, nowadays we accept that people should be able to live wherever they want to live and can afford to live, I suppose. But when she was a young girl, just before World War II, when her father moved the family, he was a well-to-do businessman, and he moved the family into an essentially all-white neighborhood because he, liked the house and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the neighbors did not like having a black family move into their neighborhood. And someone threw a brick through the window, which narrowly missed Lorraine, who was just a girl of 8 at the time. Like I say, this was before the Second World War in 1938. And they continued living there for quite some time. I don't know whether they stuck it out the whole time, but her father died relatively young on 1945. She would have been only a teenager at the time. But she was born in Chicago, and she wrote this play called A Raisin in the Sun. A Raisin in the Sun takes a line from a well-known poem by a black poet called, well, I guess maybe the actual title of the poem is A Raisin in the Sun, but the line has to do with the fact that what happens to a raisin in the sun. Well, it might explode, just from the heat of the sun and being so hot that the things that make the raisin moist begin to boil and finally explode. And that was the title of Lorraine Hansberry's famous play, which won an award as the play of the year at the time that it was written by Lorraine Hansberry. And this was it was a very popular play. It was in 1959. I remember seeing it as a movie. It was eventually made into a movie, but the book itself was written in the late 1950s, and it was in March of 1959 that her play, A Raisin in the Sun, opened on Broadway in New York and became the play of the year. It had 530 Broadway performances, which means that it ran for well over a year, and then went on tour, and eventually, as I said, became a movie. You still see Lorraine Hansberry, author of her best-known play, A Raisin in the Sun, which opened in 1959 and ran for 530 performances on Broadway. So she was quite active as Miss Hansberry, that is, was quite active as a civil rights promoter, as you can well imagine, having experienced the difficulties of moving into a white neighborhood against the wishes of the neighboring white families when she was a child herself. But it is said that she worked to dispel two widespread myths. First, that women are idiots, and second, that people are white. People may be white, they may be brown, they may be black, they may be anything. If they are people, they are people. They aren't just white. About Antoinette Brown Blackwell, born in 1825 on May 20th. She had difficulties with Oberlin. Well, Oberlin actually was a pioneer college in accepting women and black people. It was the first college that actually opened accepting black people and women people, and that was in the 1830s here in Ohio. Oberlin is up in northern Ohio, very close to Lake Erie, but not right on the lake itself. But it was a pioneer college in terms of accepting as students black people and women. So you might say, well, why did she have a problem with Oberlin? The thing was that Oberlin did accept blacks and women, but they had sort of standards. They would not let the women have a degree, finish and get a BA, Bachelor of Arts, or a BS, a Bachelor of Science degree. They could go to the literary college part of Oberlin, which did not grant degrees to women. And actually, the degrees that they did grant were basically theology degrees at that time, a degree in theology, and the male students who finished their 4-year term and so on satisfactorily got a BA degree. But the women were not permitted in the theology department because there were no women ministers at the time to speak of. So that was the problem that Antoinette Brown had as a student at Oberlin, because she wanted a degree, and she did finish a 2-year degree, but like I say, without a degree as such. She finished the course of studies in 2 years for this literary program. And then she went to the theology part of the degree, and she finished that in 3 years, but she was not granted a degree as such, since she was a woman. So that was the problem that she had. She went to a liberal college, which taught her and so on, but would not grant her a degree because she was a woman. Well, she did serve as a pastor for a couple of years. Then she converted, I'm not sure, I guess maybe she was a Congregationalist. She converted to Unitarianism and got married and started raising a family and so on. But she worked for women's rights as a suffragist, suffrage being the word for getting the vote. She was definitely a woman suffragist, and is noted for that. Now, for the 21st of May, we have Elizabeth Fry. And Elizabeth Fry was definitely a pastor. She was a Quaker. In fact, the picture of her shows her with a kind of a Quaker bonnet on, because the Quaker women wore special bonnets. And she was known for her work with prisoners. She was actually an English woman, born in England, and doing her work as a pastor in England. And she became involved with prison reform because she visited the prison at Newgate near London, and was, horrified to see that there was plenty of liquor around, but there weren't any comfortable or warm clothing or blankets for the people who were there at the prison. So she worked in prison reform, and she established a school she worked with the women's section of the prison, and she established a school. Children were often with their mothers in prison because they had no other place to go or be at that time. This was in the early 19th century, almost 200 years ago. Life was pretty grim, and of course it's always grim in a prison anyway, but it was especially grim in those days. And Elizabeth Fry, was the person who worked to make life better for the inmates in prison, especially the ones who were women prisoners. For the 22nd of May, we have Mary Cassatt. Now, Mary Cassatt, or Cassatt, was from a Pittsburgh family. This is a self-portrait of Mary Cassatt. She was a well-known painter in the late 19th century. She was a close friend of Edgar Degas, and her painting was rather similar to his because she modeled herself in part on him. The Expressionists, they were called. And she, being an American, but interested in art and wanting to receive the best of training in art, she persuaded her family to let her go to Paris and study art in probably about the 1870s. And she became one of the Expressionist painters, part of the Expressionist school of painting, like her mentor, Edward Degas. So she is well known today. Her paintings are well known today as part of the Expressionist school of painting. And that was always one of my favorite places to visit when I went to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which is a wonderful place to visit. They have art from all over the world and all times, too, you might say. So they do have a section including Expressionist paintings and so, of course, including Mary Cassatt. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., be sure to go to the National Gallery of Art. It's on the mall, and as you look down the mall from the back, shall we say, which I guess is actually the front of the Capitol building, looks down the mall toward the Lincoln Memorial, and on your right, there are, well, on both sides of the National Mall, there are these wonderful places to visit, to see science at the Smithsonian on the left, and on the right, the National Gallery of Art is one of the famous buildings lining the National Mall. And of course, like I say, you can see all kinds of wonderful art there that were gifts to the American people by wealthy Americans, for the most part, who bought famous old masters and had them on display in their own homes, and eventually many of them wound up at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. as gifts to the nation. So Mary Cassatt is definitely one of the American painters that you want to be sure that you see when you visit the National Gallery of Art. And most well-known art galleries in the United States would have at least one painting by Mary Cassatt. For the 23rd of May, we remember Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller was born in Massachusetts on May 23rd in 1810. And she was a preeminent American woman intellectual, probably the first person who could be called a sort of a professional woman intellectual in the United States. Margaret Fuller, born in 1810. She was obviously a very gifted child from the very beginning, and her father turned her into a child prodigy. She could write in Latin at age 6. I suppose she learned English when she was 5 or 4, learned how to write or those first American English, but her father had her learning Latin at age 6, and she went on to study Greek and French and so on. So she was a gifted prodigy, but apparently it was a little difficult on her because they say that she suffered from headaches all her life. And I think some people blame the fact that her father urged her on so hard to her studies as being responsible for some of the illnesses that she had. But she was the oldest of 9 children, and I guess it's not said what her father did with the other 8 children, but he certainly turned her into a child prodigy. And she even translated the works from European languages into English. I mean, continental European languages into English and so on. She was associated with the American philosophical tradition of transcendentalism, which was active. Ralph Waldo Emerson is probably the best known person who was associated with the Transcendentalists. And she became actually the editor of The Dial, which was a Transcendentalist publication in the early 1840s, and associated closely with Ralph Waldo Emerson and other Transcendentalists of the time. So one of the things she did that was different was to visit the West. Now, the West in her day was not California. I mean, California before the discovery of gold was definitely Spanish territory. We took over that territory from the Spaniards after gold was discovered in 1848 in California. But her West was Michigan. So she visited Pioneer, Michigan, Margaret Fuller did, which was the West of her time in the 1840s, early 1840s. And she wrote about the Great Lakes because she traveled. Michigan, of course, is surrounded by Great Lakes on 3 sides, It has a little bit of Lake Erie on one side, and it has Lake Michigan on the western side, and it has a part of Lake Superior to the north. So in her visit to Michigan, she saw the Great Lakes, and she wrote a book about her travels in pioneer Great Lakes territory. And then she wrote a book about women. It was called Woman in the 19th Century. And it made almost as big a fuss as Mary Wollstonecraft's book had made back in 1790 on the vindications of the rights of women. It was, you might say, the first feminist book published in the United States, Woman in the 19th Century, by Margaret Fuller. And then she went to Europe to sort of the grand tour. That was a sort of a tradition that a lot of American and English men did during the 19th century, was to go to continental Europe and visit France and Germany and Italy and see the continent. And she did that in the 1840s. And she had already worked in New York City for the Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was a famous publisher, newspaper publisher of the New York Tribune in the 1840s. And she was the first woman who sent back clippings, things that became clippings from Europe. She was the first foreign correspondent, you might say, Margaret Fuller, when she went to Europe in the 1840s. And her life changed in Europe. Actually, she got married at about age 38 or 39 to a man who was 10 years younger than she was, and they had a son. And unfortunately, she and her family perished in a shipwreck off of Long Island, Fire Island, on their way back from Europe. The ship sank and all three of them drowned, she, her husband, and her baby. But Margaret Fuller was definitely a woman to be reckoned with in the 19th century, the author of the first feminist book in the United States called Woman in the 19th Century. For the 25th of May, we have Laura Dewey Bridgman. Laura Bridgman is shown here in this picture wearing dark glasses. She was the first, you've all heard of Helen Keller, I'm sure, who was both deaf and blind. Well, Laura Bridgman was the first deaf and blind person in the United States who became well known for having overcome, as far as she possibly could, the tragedy of being both deaf and blind and therefore unable to communicate in the usual ways that we count on, that people count on. She was a student at the Perkins School in Massachusetts, which Helen Keller also visited and was a student at, and that was before the time of Helen Keller. In fact, Laura Bridgman was still at Perkins. She never actually left because she continued there and was, helped in what way she could with the students, in spite of her own deafness and blindness at the Perkins School in Massachusetts. And so I imagine she must have been there at the same time that Helen Keller went there for a while, because she did spend her whole life there. For the 25th of May, we have Winifred Black, and her death date was the 25th of May, and that was in 1936. She became the first well-known woman journalist in America, and she took the name Annie Laurie. That was her journalist's name, like the woman who had also become a journalist. We have gone on so quickly that we're to the 26th of May, and that was the birth date of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, famous world traveler, and she wound up dying abroad. She was an English woman who decided she wanted to see the world, and she really did. The 27th of May is the birth date of Rachel Carson of 1907. She was born on the 27th of May. And also Amelia Bloomer, who popularized the Bloomer idea, which had both a skirt and sort of like long pants. And this is what it looked like, the bloomers. And also on May 27th, not only Rachel Carson, the environmentalist, but also Julia Ward Howe, also a famous author. She popularized Mother's Day, but she was interested in Mother's Day for peace. And nowadays, Mother's Day is mostly, time to get some candy for Mom. The 28th of May, death date of Anne Bronte, one of the writing sisters. Charlotte and Emily were her sisters, and Anne wrote a novel as well. The 29th of May, Louise Michel, born in 1830, and she was a famous radical of the 19th century. She was even sent, off to Australia, locked up in a cage on the way over there because she was a well-known radical and had been involved in the Paris Commune. The 30th of May, death date of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc died. She was about 19 years old in 1431. The British captured her because she was supporting the French, of course, and eventually they burned her at the stake. Then the 31st of May, Elizabeth Blackwell, death date of Elizabeth Blackwell, who was a famous woman doctor, one of the first MDs who was a doctor, Elizabeth Blackwell, May 31. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.